Hi, welcome to an emergency Bulwark podcast. I'm Mona Charen, host of Beg to Differ and Just Between Us, and I'm joined by Ben Parker, who is an expert in all things Russian, has a degree in Russian studies, and speaks fluent Russian. And I thought we could learn a lot from Ben about the news that we received just a few hours ago. That Alexei Navalny, who has been in a Russian prison for 3 years and is only 47, we hear now, is dead. So, Ben, can you set this up for us? I mean, why was he in prison for the last 3 years? Who is he in the Russian context? Explain to us who this man was.
Sure. Alexei Navalny was the second most important Russian politician of the Putin era. He was the only significant opposition politician to Putin who was able to rally mass support, not just in Moscow and St. Petersburg and some of the other large cities, but across Russia, and also importantly, not just among Russian nationalists who are disappointed with Putin's rule, not just with liberals who would like to see a rule of law society, but with a broad swath of society on the issue of corruption. That was his main issue. His organization was called the Anti-Corruption Foundation, and that's where he organized his politics. He was in jail nominally for fraud and for being a foreign agent. He was actually in jail for being an opponent to Putin. And just to give you an idea of how much of an opponent to Putin he was, in 2020, he was on a flight within Russia from one Russian city to another when he suddenly fell catastrophically ill. And by that I mean he went from being perfectly healthy 1 minute to being on the verge of death a few minutes later. And when that happens to someone like Navalny, an opponent of Putin in Putin's Russia, it usually means one thing. He received some initial medical treatment in Russia and then was flown to Germany for more advanced treatment, and they did confirm that he had been poisoned with Novichok, which is a proprietary nerve agent of the Russian security services. Putin tried to kill him. With the help of the Bellingcat open source intelligence organization, Navalny was actually able to find the specific FSB officer who administered the poison to him by means of his tea and underwear, and called him up on the phone and said, "I'm the one who tried to poison him.
Wait, who called who on the phone? Who called who on the phone?
Navalny called the man who poisoned him, the specific FSB officer, on the phone and recorded it in a YouTube
Right,
video.
but he didn't say who he was, right? He pretended to be somebody else?
That's right, and he got him to admit to the whole thing.
And recorded it?
Yeah, in a YouTube video. He then, once he had recuperated in Germany, went back to Russia. He is one of a number of Russian opposition politicians who, fully aware of the dangers they face, did refuse to leave, or have refused to leave. You know, he was a Russian patriot. He didn't like the direction of his country. He didn't like the people leading it, but it was his country, and he was going to stay there and do everything he could, probably knowing full well that he would end up in jail, and probably knowing full well that if he ended up in jail, he would probably die in jail.
So, first of all, I think that's something for us to think about, that, there is a tendency to think that, Russians who support, who can be led by the likes of Putin, they must all be like him. And of course, there are so many incredibly inspiring people within Russia who are willing, even at the cost of their freedom or even their lives, are willing to stand up against him, and their courage is such an inspiration. So, by the way, as you said, hardly the first one to do this. There was Boris Nemtsov. There was that woman journalist who was murdered in her elevator in her building.
Yeah, there are too many to name. So Boris Nemtsov was at one point, I believe, deputy prime minister of Russia under Yeltsin. He was a major opposition politician, a very successful governor of one of the larger regions of Russia during the tumultuous 1990s. And he was shot in the back just a few hundred yards from the Kremlin walls in February of 2015. we're actually coming up on the anniversary of his assassination. At the time, this was about a year into the first part of Russia's war against Ukraine, and he was about to publish a report about all of the Russian casualties, the secret Russian casualties that were being buried in unmarked graves in Ukraine. Something that may be the motivation for his assassination. Before him, there's a whole string of people who have fallen out of windows, suffered mysterious heart attacks, including overseas in places like London or Washington, D.C. And as you said, there was Anna Politkovskaya, who had the temerity to report on the facts of the Russian war in Grozny, on which Putin built so much of his fame and reputation, on which he built his ascendancy to the presidency. And she, at one point, probably survived a poisoning and then was shot in her elevator and her body dumped a little bit away. And it's worth also mentioning two people who are still languishing in Russian prisons. One of them is Ilya Yashin, a Russian opposition politician who was jailed towards the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And another is Vladimir Karamurza, who I believe is a dual Russian-British national and a U.S. permanent resident, who has survived not one but two poisonings, and is also currently facing 25 years in a Russian jail, and both of their lives should be considered in grave danger.
Okay, tell us a little bit more about, so sorry, I keep confusing all these people. Navalny made his bones taking on the corruption of the Russian elite and even of Putin himself. So tell us what, so he was circulating funny videos, right, about the way the elite were living and all of that. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, this was sort of, the secret of his success was that he focused on corruption. And this made him a little bit of a cipher politically. Back in the 2010s, he had some really nasty and disgusting comments about people from Central Asia and the Caucasus. He referred to them as cockroaches at one point. Really disgusting stuff. He never repudiated those comments, but he also never repeated them. And he is far from the only Russian politician who has tried to bridge the divide between the nationalists and the liberals to create a larger opposition to Putin. And he figured out that the way to do it, and also the way to tap into sort of the non-intellectual political dissatisfaction of the mass of the Russian people, was by focusing on corruption. So he did two things. One are the videos you mentioned. His team did really, he built a team, which is something that the Russian opposition is not great at doing. He built a team, and they did really, really good investigations into the houses, the chateaus, the castles that people like Putin and former President and Prime Minister Medvedev and Defense Minister Shoigu have built for themselves, way beyond what they could afford on their nominal salaries. These are really unbelievable kinds of places. And they were able to use, for lack of a better term, new media, YouTube especially, and social media to disseminate these far and wide. The other thing he did is that he built a political organization. He ran for mayor of Moscow about 10 years ago. He was actually able to be on the ballot. He didn't win, of course. But then he built a political organization. The Anti-Corruption Foundation had offices all across Russia. It organized people. He would recommend strategic voting to people. He would say, if you're in this election or this election, vote for whoever is the most likely non-Putinist candidate. I don't care if it's the Communist Party candidate or if it's a nationalist or if it's a liberal, if you're in Moscow or St. Petersburg and able to vote for someone like that. And that appeared to frazzle, if not Putin himself, then people in the Putin regime quite a bit. Of course, he was declared a foreign agent after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. He opposed the war after February 2022. His entire organization was basically rounded up and shut down, and those who left Russia. But basically, this organization exists only in exile now.
So, have you been following how he's been? I recall seeing reports from time to time that Navalny had serious medical troubles and wasn't being cared for within the system. And then the last I heard was he'd been moved to this Siberian camp, basically, far from anybody, and of course, still not getting medical attention.
Yeah. You said before we started recording, you said he'd been murdered, rather killed, or rather he was dead, and I think you had it right. I mean, this was, in all likelihood, a slow motion murder. Russia is not famous for the quality of its prisons, especially if you're a regime opponent.
Then their supermarkets are the state of the art. Tucker Carlson told us. Anyway, sorry, go on.
I'd like to see what Tucker Carlson could do on the average Russian's yearly salary, but yeah.
Yeah.
This is why when he was sentenced to a long prison term, everyone expected him to die in prison. Not because he would be in prison for as long as Putin is alive, but also because this is probably a slow motion murder in which he is put in conditions that are not hospitable to life and then denied medical care. For example, this is basically how Sergei Magnitsky, the Russian lawyer who uncovered a massive fraud scheme by the government, and after whom the Magnitsky sanctions laws, both in the U.S. and around the world, are named, this is how he died. He was basically left to rot in unlivable conditions and also beaten and then denied medical care, and eventually he died. And they told his family he died of a heart attack, and when they were able to view his body, there were clear signs of trauma and torture. I don't know if Navalny was beaten, but certainly there were no efforts made to keep him alive.
Right. And they certainly don't get Red Cross visits in Siberia. So what's your sense of Putin's status right now? So we just saw a report in one of the papers. I didn't get a chance to read it closely, but it was just, I think it was in the Times, and it was about how, the West imposed the most vigorous sanctions imaginable on Russia after February 22nd, 2022, or was it 2023? 2022.
It was 2022, yes.
2022, when they invaded Ukraine the second time. And the Russians have been able to sell their goods to China and to India and to buy stuff they need from North Korea and Iran. Is he untouchable? Can we not? I mean, obviously, the best thing to do right now would be to redouble our efforts to help Ukraine, right, in response to this. Very questionable whether that's going to happen. But what about all those sanctions? I mean, is Russia doing okay despite all that?
So with sanctions, there are two questions always to keep in mind. The first is, are we talking about legislation or are we talking about enforcement? And the second question is, what are the sanctions designed to do and what can they do? The first question, we have really ratcheted up sanctions on Russia based on the laws and rules that are on the books. We've sanctioned a lot of their most important economic assets. We've targeted sanctions in such a way that it is designed, I'll say, to make it much more difficult for them to procure military technology. That's a huge project that requires a lot of people doing a lot of research, and it requires people in the Treasury Department, working with people in the intelligence community, working with people in the State Department. One of the ways that Russia has gotten around sanctions is by working with intermediary countries, Turkey, Kazakhstan, some others. You're allowed to sell advanced technology to Turkey. Why wouldn't you? They're a NATO ally. Of course you can. And Turkey's allowed to resell it to Russia. It creates a difficult political situation. What are we going to do? To turn the screws on the Turks? We have enough problems with them as it is. The second question, what are sanctions designed to do? There's some disagreement about this among political scientists and people who study such things, but basically the evidence seems to be that economic sanctions are not very good at getting countries or leaders to change their behavior. They're and especially think this is the case for Putin, there is no amount of sanctions that will convince him to leave Ukraine. That's not how it works. What they are good at is limiting your opponent's capacity. So as I said, we've designed sanctions that make it much more difficult for Russia to run its economy, which is heavily dependent on exports of petroleum products, gas and oil, and to import advanced technologies that they need for their military. They are selling a lot of oil and gas to China and India and other places. They're selling it at well below what the market rate was before the war. And that's not just because the prices come down, it's because the Chinese are squeezing them. Right? The Chinese don't care.
Why wouldn't they?
Yeah. We'll buy oil at a 40, 50% discount. Great.
Yeah.
The other thing is, yes, they're able to import artillery from North Korea. They're able to import artillery ammunition, especially from North Korea. That artillery ammunition is, I'm sure, of worse quality than what they could have made at home. They're able to import drones from Iran. Those are troubling, but they're reliant on Iran now. And in some ways, the power relationship between Russia and Iran is flipped because of this. And in some ways, Russia is now more a client of Iran than the other way around. That's a new development and not a welcome one for them. So no, this won't end the war, but I am pretty optimistic that in the long run, 5-10 years, the sanctions are making Russia less of a long-term military threat to NATO. Everything just becomes more expensive for them. They can still buy advanced optics, they can still buy weapons, they can still buy enough machinery and mass to throw a million things at the enemy, which is what the Russian army has always done. It just becomes more expensive. That leads me to my final point, which is that the managers of the Russian sort of macroeconomy, their central bank chair Nabulina, they are very capable. And they have done a really good job propping up the Russian economy and stabilizing the ruble, among other things, so far. It comes at a cost. The Russian government is spending huge amounts on defense right now. It has swallowed the federal budget, and it is providing for a huge amount of its GDP. So while you see Russian GDP growth is strong, if you separate out how much of that is government expenditure and how much of that is consumption and investment is basically dried up. Basically, everyone is just consuming what they can, and the rest is the government spending on defense. So it looks like 2024 is going to be a manageable year for them, and it's going to be a year in which they have to make several important victories. They have to find some way of succeeding in Ukraine. They have to manage Putin's re-election, which is coming up, and they have to help Donald Trump get elected. And if they can do that, they can survive. God. 2025 is going to be a much more difficult year for them. It looks like right now. Things could change. But it looks like 2025, they're already seeing inflation that makes ours look minimal. For example, there were just protests in Russia over the price of eggs. Not because the price of eggs was increasing faster than everything else, but because people had already stopped buying meat, and they were running out of affordable forms of protein. And when so the price of eggs goes up,
that's the last straw.
That's the last straw. So they're facing real inflationary pressures, as always happens when government spending swallows the economy, and they can't stop because they need to win the war. So they're in a bind for next year, and we're in a bind for this year. So, pick your poison.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Let me ask you about just the whole phenomenon of Tucker Carlson and the useful idiocy here. I mean, I think Carlson knows what he's doing. I think he's very familiar with the well-worn path of formerly, it used to be leftists in America who would travel overseas to some dictatorship and say things are so great here. I wrote a whole book about them. But this is so blatant. And the thing, I guess, that it's very hard for me to get my brain around is that whenever you have these political pilgrims who go abroad and say things are so much better there, first of all, they have no interest in how things really are in the country that they're visiting. They're perfectly happy with a Potemkin tour. Oh, the beautiful supermarkets. Oh, the beautiful subway station. When they've seen one supermarket and one subway station, and they've made no effort to see the real way that people live. But the thing is that they don't care. The reason they're praising the foreign dictator or the foreign country is so that because they hate their own country, and they can sort of use that as a foil and say, unlike in the United States where we have X, Y, and Z problem. But, for any American, red-blooded American who was raised in this country and understands our values. In fact, you don't have to be an American. You just have to be a decent human. To be an apologist for a person like Putin, like this morning, do you think Tucker Carlson is thinking, oh, God, I wish I hadn't been making those videos right now when he goes and murders Navalny? I mean, what goes through these people's minds? How do you think this is received? Any thoughts on the phenomenon of the useful idiot?
So 3 thoughts. The first is Putin has murdered tens of thousands of people.
Yeah.
In Georgia, in his own country, in Ukraine, around the world. Navalny is was an important political leader in Russia, but I see no reason why that should change Carlson's mind. I hate to quibble with the person who literally wrote the book on the subject, but I don't think Carlson's a useful idiot. I think he's a fellow traveler.
Well,
I don't...
Yeah, not all useful idiots are naive.
Right. I mean, I think the term useful idiot, which may be apocryphal or may actually come from an Italian or whatever.
Right.
But refers to someone who is unwittingly helping you destroy them, basically.
Yeah.
And I don't think Carlson is unwitting. As you said,
I
think
agree.
Exactly what he's doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
He also did say this morning, I'm not sure if you've seen this yet, he was asked in an interview, when you interviewed Putin, you didn't mention that there's no freedom of speech in Russia, you didn't mention that there's no right to organize politically, you didn't mention that he kills people. And he said, oh, well, my country kills people too. Leadership requires killing people.
Wow.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Wow, we are headed in a really, really, really dark direction. Because there are just so many Americans who actually have given up on small L liberalism and rule of law, and they actually do believe that. They believe in authoritarianism and murder and extrajudicial murder. Remember how we always talk about how Trump praises Putin. Will on a podcast recently said, I guess that lottery. Those lottery winnings keep rising for the person who can find an example of Trump ever criticizing Putin, which he's never done. Mm-hmm. But I remember noticing it even for small-time tin pot dictators like Duterte of the Philippines. Duterte comes into power. By the way, similar to Trump in that he's incredibly vulgar. He laces all of it. He's gone now, but he laced all of his speeches with profanity and so forth. But worse than profanity, he said he wanted to kill drug dealers. And he said he boasted that he had killed some with his own bare hands. Or with his own pistol, I forget. It may not have been bare hands. But in any event, he posted. And the Philippine electorate chose him. And, okay.
And he
you
did.
Say, oh, well. And he did it. And so, there were thousands upon thousands of people on mere suspicion of being drug dealers who were gunned down in the streets by the Philippine police. They had these little motorcycle brigades that went around shooting people. And Donald Trump went out of his way to praise Duterte for getting a handle on the drug problem. He praised Xi Jinping for, he said they don't have a drug problem in China, which is, again, of course, they do have a drug problem in China. It's a preposterous thing to say. But supposedly because they kill their drug dealers right away, no trials. Trump's very admiring of that.
He really hates trials, doesn't he?
Yeah.
I'll just say this. One of the... yeah, he hates trials. One of the one of the proudest moments I ever had was at the Bulwark. Was JVL had referred in one of his Triad newsletters to Putin as Trump's favorite dictator, and so I immediately, when I read that, I sent him a Slack message and I said, "I'm so sorry, but I have to fact check you." And I had a link to the video where Trump very clearly said, "Al-Sisi of Egypt is my favorite dictator." Yeah. It's like he had actually already nominated someone. You didn't have to guess. And so JVL left a comment and said, I'm so sorry, correction. Actually, Putin is somewhere farther down the rankings. He has a definite list of his favorite dictators.
Oh my God. And
but there, look, I mean, we are lucky in that we live in a country that has been an imperfect democracy for a long time. And we have a history of reforming it and reinventing it and saving it from various crises. And it's hard to look back at a single decade in American history that wasn't some sort of crisis. That's just how history is. You look at Russia, which has never really had a fully competitive democracy. Maybe for a blip in the 90s, but even then, not really. And yet they have this long tradition of people who just want to live in a free country, or as they often call it, a normal country. A normal country like the countries on their border. This is what the Ukrainians wanted too. And so you can gun down, you can murder Anna Politkovskaya, and you get Boris Nemtsov. And you can gun down Boris Nemtsov outside the Kremlin, and you get Vladimir Kara-Murza. And you can try to poison Kara-Murza, and you can throw him in jail, and you get Alexei Navalny. And you can kill Navalny, but you can't kill Navalnyism. There will always be more people who believe in this. If you can't kill it in Russia, where can you kill it?
No, that's a good note to end on. I mean, that the human spirit keeps rising above the ashes, and so we have to take heart and inspiration from that. So thank you so much, Ben, for being able to jump on and join me on short notice, and we'll be seeing you on the Bulwark.